Have you ever judged someone, and found out, way too late, that the story you told yourself was a lie? Because what I'm about to tell you is about a man who spent 15 years believing a version of events, 15 years building a truth inside his own head, 15 years sleeping soundly while the reality, the actual reality, was so different from what he imagined that when he finally saw it, he couldn't even stand. His name was Richard Mendez. And his story is going to change the way you look at the people around you, maybe forever. But first I need to take you to the beginning. The real beginning. And the beginning isn't pretty. Richard was 52 years old when this story took place. He owned a chain of dental clinics in Austin, Texas, 6 locations spread across the city, over 120 employees, revenue that topped $2 million a month. The kind of businessman people look at and think, that guy made it. Imported car. Penthouse condo downtown, one of those places where a single square foot costs more than most people make in weeks. Son studying medicine at a top university in New York. And a pain. A pain he'd been carrying in his chest since 2018, the year his wife, Claudia, died of a cancer that consumed her in 7 months. 7 months. From a late diagnosis, because she was one of those women who never complain, who say, "It's nothing, I'm fine," to her last breath. And Richard stood there, on his feet, holding her hand in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, feeling her body cool down slowly while the machine made that continuous sound, that long flat beep, that nobody forgets once they've heard it. That sound that splits anyone's life into before and after. He didn't cry at the funeral. He stood there in his black suit, face set like stone, receiving hugs from everyone, shaking hands, hearing "my condolences" 200 times, and didn't shed a single tear. Didn't cry at the memorial service a week later. Didn't cry when he went home and saw her clothes still in the closet, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her scent still on the pillow. He didn't cry. He went back to work the following Monday as if nothing had happened. Because that's how Richard operated. Always had. Since he was a kid. He didn't feel things. He fixed things. Problem showed up, he fixed it. Emotion showed up, he locked it away. Did it work? On the outside, sure. On the inside, well, nobody saw the inside. And the business grew. Grew precisely because he poured everything he had into work. Every hour he would have spent with Claudia, he spent at the clinic. Every dinner they would have had together, he replaced with a meeting with suppliers, with dentists, with the marketing team. Every Sunday that would have been theirs, those Sundays Claudia loved, when they'd go to the farmer's market downtown and she'd buy artisanal jam and he'd pretend he didn't like it but ate it all. Every one of those Sundays became a spreadsheet, a target, an expansion plan. And it worked. The chain grew. The 4th clinic came. Then the 5th. Then the 6th. The numbers climbed. The awards rolled in. His name showed up in business magazines. Austin entrepreneur multiplies dental clinic chain and earns millions. It worked. At least that's what he thought. But we need to go further back in time for this story to make sense. We need to go back to 2011. And to understand 2011, you need to understand the Richard of that era. Back then he only had 3 clinics. The business was growing, but it was still at that stage where the owner does everything. He saw patients in the morning, negotiated with insurance companies in the afternoon, hired and fired when needed, and closed the register at night. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave. And Claudia was right there beside him. She always was. She handled the administrative side, not because she had a degree in business, but because she was organized, she was good with people, and because when you're married to an entrepreneur building something from scratch, you become a partner even without signing any contract. And it was that year, 2011, that a young woman named Denise walked into their lives. Denise Oliver. She was 24. Had just finished her business administration degree at a local college in Austin. It wasn't an Ivy League school, it wasn't a state flagship, It was a community-level program where she studied at night for 4 years while working whatever job she could find during the day. And she submitted her resume for an administrative assistant position at the downtown clinic. Her resume was simple. 1 page. No relevant experience. No referrals. No internship at a Fortune 500. No study abroad. Nothing that jumped off the page. The kind of resume most recruiters glance at for 3 seconds and toss into the no pile. But Claudia, who spent her afternoons helping sort through applications while sipping coffee and listening to the radio, Claudia looked at that piece of paper and said something that would change everything. She said, "Call this girl in for an interview, Richard." And he asked why. The resume had nothing special. And Claudia pointed at the address. Riverside. If you're not from Austin, maybe that doesn't mean much. Riverside was one of the most underserved neighborhoods on the east side. Far from the business district. For someone from there to get to downtown by bus took over an hour. Sometimes an hour and a half. Depending on the time of day, 2 hours. And Claudia said, "Richard, this girl lives in Riverside." For her to come all the way downtown to drop off a resume in person, because back then a lot of people still did that, hand-delivered printed resumes, for her to make that bus trip, pay her fare, and come here to hand it over, she wants this badly. And someone who wants it that badly deserves a chance. Richard looked at Claudia. Looked at the resume. And called her in. And Denise showed up. On time. 5 minutes early, actually. Simple but clean clothes, pressed, put together. Hair pulled back in a tight bun. She sat in the chair, placed her purse on her lap, looked Richard in the eye, and waited. No visible anxiety. No desperation of a first-time interviewee. A calm that seemed deliberate. And Richard asked the question he asked everyone. Why do you want to work here? And most people give that rehearsed answer. Because I believe in the company's mission. Because I identify with the healthcare sector. Because I'm seeking professional growth in an organization that values its team members. Blah, blah, blah. Denise didn't say any of that. Denise said, because I need a job and this position is the best match for what I know how to do. And I learn fast. Straight. No embellishment. No verbal makeup. And something Richard noticed in those first few minutes, Denise had a way of speaking that conveyed an almost uncomfortable honesty. The kind of honesty that makes most people uneasy because we're so used to people performing that when someone tells the raw truth it almost feels rude. But it wasn't rudeness. It was transparency. It was a 24-year-old who hadn't learned how to lie professionally yet. Or maybe, and this is the more beautiful possibility, maybe she'd chosen not to learn. Richard liked her. Liked her immediately. Hired her on the spot, before the interview was even over. And Denise started the following Monday. And she really did learn fast. That wasn't just talk. Within 3 months she'd mastered the clinic's scheduling system, a system full of quirks and shortcuts that the receptionist who'd been there 4 years still hadn't memorized. Within 6 months, Denise was solving insurance disputes that nobody else in the clinic could handle, those claim denials, those coverage rejections, that insane bureaucracy that makes dentists want to quit everything and go sell coconuts on a beach. She'd call the insurance company, ask for the reference number, cite the contract clause, and resolve it. Within a year, she was the person everyone went to when something went wrong. When the system crashed, call Denise. When a patient complained, call Denise. When supplies ran short, call Denise. She was the balancing point of that clinic. And Richard saw it. Saw it and admired it. He'd tell Claudia at dinner, "That girl's going places, Claudia, mark my words." And Claudia agreed. More than agreed, Claudia sort of adopted Denise. That's how I describe it. It wasn't a boss-employee relationship. It was something else. Claudia started bringing an extra lunch for her, because she found out Denise ate a cheap sandwich almost every day, not by choice but to save money. She'd ask how Denise's mother was doing. She'd give her a ride home at the end of the shift when it rained, and in Austin it can rain hard, those sudden downpours that soak you to the bone in seconds. She'd lend her an umbrella. Bring a spare jacket when the air conditioning in the clinic ran too cold. That thing that only people with real empathy do, caring without expecting anything in return. Without posting about it. Without telling anyone. Without turning it into a virtue to display. Just caring. And Denise was grateful. You could see it in the way she treated Claudia. With a respect that went beyond professional. Beyond polite. It was almost filial. As if Claudia were the role model of a secure, grounded, self-assured woman that Denise had never had at home. Because Denise's mother, Marlene, was a sick woman. Severe depression since Denise was a teenager. The kind of depression that doesn't get better with herbal tea and positive thinking. The kind that knocks you down, paralyzes you, turns a person into a shadow of themselves. Marlene could barely take care of herself. Barely got out of bed. And Denise grew up being the adult in the house from the age of 13, 14. Cooking meals. Paying bills. Taking her mother to the doctor. Smiling for two. So when Claudia appeared in her life, with that warm way of treating people, with that gentle firmness, with that, "Come here, honey, sit next to me," Denise found something that life had denied her. And Claudia knew. Without anyone needing to explain. She just knew. So Denise repaid it by being the most dedicated employee that clinic had ever seen. First to arrive. Last to leave. Never missed a day. Never complained. Covered for sick coworkers, swapped shifts without asking for anything, stayed late when needed without requesting overtime. And this went on from 2011 to 2013. 2 years. 2 years where everything worked. Where the gears turned smoothly. Where Denise grew, Claudia cared, and Richard admired from a distance. Until 2013 arrived. And here is where the story starts to darken. In 2013, the company was at a turning point. The 3 clinics had become 4. Richard was negotiating the 5th, a prime commercial space on a busy avenue that was going to cost a fortune in renovation. And he realized he couldn't run everything on instinct anymore. He needed process. Method. He needed someone to look at the company from the outside and say, "This is right, this is wrong, this needs to change." He hired a consulting firm. One of those management companies that charges a premium, shows up in tailored suits, uses jargon half the time, and treats people like resources. The lead consultant, a guy named Marcus, MBA from some prestigious school, slicked back hair, handshake a little too firm. Marcus spent 2 months inside the clinics. Analyzed everything. Processes. Workflow. Costs. Individual productivity of every single employee. And at the end of those 2 months, he delivered an 87-page report. 87. With charts. With matrices. With those words consultants love and normal people hate: headcount optimization, efficient allocation of human capital, individual performance indicators. And the first thing Marcus said in the presentation meeting was a phrase that burned itself into Richard's memory. He said, "You need processes, controls, and you need to cut the fat." Cut the fat. That expression. As if people were fat. As if human beings who wake up early, take crowded buses, work all day, and go home exhausted to take care of kids, sick parents, and stacking bills, were fat to be trimmed. But anyway, the consultant ran an individual analysis of every employee. Every single one. With scores. With behavioral profiles. With 3-year cost versus return projections. And in the final report, somewhere around page 60-something, Denise's name appeared on a list Marcus called reallocation candidates. It wasn't termination. It wasn't for cause. It was a suggestion that Denise would be more useful in a repetitive operational role than in the administrative position she held. The argument was technical. The consultant said she didn't have the analytical profile needed to advance in the area. That her aptitude test scores had come in below average. That her ceiling was right where she was, in that role, and that investing in her through training and promotions would be a waste of resources because the return wouldn't justify the investment. Cold. Surgical. Impersonal. Exactly how a consulting report is designed to be. Richard read it and felt uneasy. That bad taste in his mouth. Because he saw Denise every day. Saw how hard she worked. Saw how much she'd grown since she started. Saw how patients liked her, how coworkers trusted her, how the clinic ran better with her there. But the consultant had numbers. Had metrics. Had charts. Had that coldness of someone who looks at people as gears in a machine. If the gear doesn't perform at the expected level, replace it. And Richard, who had always been a man of reason, of logic, of spreadsheets, started weighing things. Started wondering if the affection he and Claudia felt for Denise was clouding his professional judgment. If he was being paternalistic. If he was holding on to a mediocre employee out of pity. Or worse, out of guilt. Because he knew about her hard life, the sick mother, the humble origins, and maybe that had created a kind of emotional blind spot. And it was in this state, this tug-of-war between what his heart said and what the report said, that something happened. Something that sealed Denise's fate at the company. Something small. Almost insignificant. Something that lasted less than 5 seconds. But that changed the lives of at least 3 people forever. It was a Friday. End of the workday. Almost 7 in the evening. The downtown clinic was already dark in the treatment rooms, and only the reception area was still lit. Richard was in his office, a small room in the back, cluttered with folders and paperwork, finishing up a dispute with a dental supply vendor who'd sent the wrong invoice. And when he was done, he got up to leave and realized he'd left his personal phone at the front desk. He'd set it down earlier when he went to sort something out with the receptionist. He walked to the reception area. His shoes clicking on the tile floor, click, click, click. The clinic was silent. And when he turned the corner and reached the front desk, he saw Denise. She was alone. Sitting at the reception computer. The glow of the screen lighting up her face. And when she heard his footsteps, when she realized someone was approaching, she minimized the screen. Fast. Too fast. 1 click. That instinctive, reflexive movement that everyone recognizes, the movement of someone doing something they don't want seen. Richard stopped. For a fraction of a second, maybe a full second, he looked at the minimized screen. And Denise looked at him. And they both knew, in that instant, that something had shifted. But Richard said nothing. Didn't ask. Didn't open his mouth. He picked up the phone that was sitting there next to the keyboard, said, "Good night, Denise," and left. His car was in the building's parking garage. He got in, started the engine, and sat there for a few minutes before pulling out. Thinking. What was she doing? Browsing social media during work hours? Sending her resume to another company? Looking at personal stuff on the company computer? Shopping online? Chatting with someone she shouldn't be? For you and me, this might seem like nothing. An employee who minimizes her screen. It happens every day in every office in the world. But for Richard, in that moment, with that consultant's report fresh in his mind, with that doubt already installed about Denise's future at the company, with that part of him that was already looking for a reason, that gesture, that minimized screen, became proof. Became confirmation. Became the final argument he needed to make the decision that a part of him already wanted to make. Because that's how the mind works, isn't it? We don't look for the truth. We look for what confirms what we've already decided to feel. In psychology they have a name for it, confirmation bias. But in real life we don't call it that. In real life we call it, I'm sure. The following Monday, 2 days later, Richard called the downtown clinic's manager, a guy named Phil. Called him into his office, closed the door, and asked him to check the browsing history on the reception computer for that Friday after 7 in the evening. Phil was surprised. Asked if something had happened. And Richard said it was routine, that he wanted to make sure employees were using company equipment appropriately, and to keep it between them. Phil went, checked, and came back the next day with a printed sheet. The browsing history. And there it was. Denise, at 7:17 on that Friday evening, had accessed an online education website. A distance learning platform. And she'd been browsing specifically a course in financial management. She'd spent 23 minutes on that site. Looking at the course curriculum. Looking at the price. Looking at the payment options. And right there, for Richard, it all became clear. Crystal clear. She was getting ready to leave. She was using company time, even though it was after hours. She was using the company computer, the company internet, to seek qualifications that would serve another employer. She was upskilling to jump ship. It was disloyalty. It was a lack of professional ethics. It was everything the consultant had implied about her not being the right fit. In Richard's mind, the pieces snapped together perfectly. The report said she didn't have the profile to advance. She minimized the screen because she was doing something she was hiding. She was browsing courses to leave. Logical conclusion, Denise already had one foot out the door. Just waiting for the right moment. Logical. Perfect. Unquestionable. And completely wrong. But Richard didn't know that. Not then. In that moment, he knew, with that absolute certainty that is the sweetest poison there is, that he was right. And he made a decision. He decided he wouldn't fire Denise. No. Firing would be messy. Dramatic. Claudia would be upset, and he didn't want to deal with Claudia's disappointment, which was quiet but came with that heavy silence that lasted days. And it would create gossip at the clinic. He'd have to pay full severance. He'd have to explain. No. Not firing. He did something worse. Something that bosses, managers, executives do all the time and that nobody calls by its real name. He froze her out. Stopped assigning new responsibilities. When a project came up, he gave it to someone else. When there was a planning meeting, he forgot to include her. When she sent an email with a suggestion, he replied with "Okay, thanks," and never followed through. When a promotion opened up, a coordinator position that Denise was the most obvious candidate for, Richard gave it to an employee with half Denise's experience but who had an MBA and spoke 2 languages. When it came time for annual raises, Denise got the bare minimum. He built a glass ceiling so low, so invisible, so cowardly subtle, that Denise could only crouch there, suffocating, without understanding why. Because nobody told her anything. Nobody sat her down and said, "Look, Denise, here's what's going on." No. It was all between the lines. In what wasn't said. In the invitation that never came. In the door that didn't open. In the smile that got shorter. In the distance that grew without making a sound. And Denise felt it. Of course she felt it. She wasn't dumb. She was perceptive. Maybe the most perceptive person in that clinic. She felt the temperature change. Felt the wind shift. Felt that something had broken, just didn't know what. In the months that followed, she tried to talk to Richard. Twice. The first time, it was in a hallway, between patients. She said, "Richard, is everything okay? I feel like, did I do something wrong?" And he said, with that tone bosses use when they want to shut down a conversation without seeming rude, "Everything's fine, Denise, it's just a phase. The company's restructuring, it's normal, it happens." The second time, about 3 weeks later, she asked to speak with him in his office. Sat in the chair, looked him in the eye, and said, "I want to grow here, Richard. Tell me what I need to do to move up." And Richard, notice the irony, Richard told her she needed to show more results. More results. An employee who arrived first and left last. Who had never missed a single day in 2 years. who had never complained about anything, who solved problems nobody else could solve. That employee needed to show more results. Denise left his office and went to the restroom. Stayed there for 15 minutes. Nobody knows what she did in those 15 minutes. But when she came out, her eyes were red. Claudia noticed something was off. Claudia noticed everything. She had this almost supernatural ability to read the mood of a room and know exactly who was fine and who was faking it. And she asked Richard. At dinner. In that kitchen in the downtown penthouse, with that view of the Austin skyline all lit up. She said, Richard, what's going on with Denise? She's different. She's dimming. It's like her light is going out. And Richard answered with the certainty of someone who believes their own narrative, because his story was already so crystallized, so solid, that for him it was fact and not interpretation. He said, Denise isn't interested in the company anymore, Claudia. She's looking for something else. I saw it with my own eyes. Claudia went quiet. Didn't agree. Didn't disagree. Didn't argue. Didn't fight. Went quiet. Stood up from the table, carried her plate to the sink, and stood there with her back turned, washing dishes for a while. And Richard interpreted that silence as agreement. But it wasn't agreement. Not even close. It was the silence of a woman who knew that arguing would be useless. Who knew that her husband had decided, and that once Richard decided, there wasn't an argument in the world that would change his mind. It was the silence of someone who disagreed so deeply that she didn't even know where to begin explaining. And 2 months later, 2 months of ice, of closed doors, of denied opportunities, of smiles that stopped coming. Denise resigned. She resigned in a handwritten letter. Blue ink. Small, careful handwriting, the kind you almost never see anymore, because who still writes by hand with that kind of care? A short letter. 3 paragraphs. Thanking them for the opportunity. Thanking her coworkers. Thanking especially, and she underlined the word, especially Claudia. Saying she needed to move on. And at the end, a sentence that Richard skimmed over at the time but that now, 15 years later, he realized he should never have ignored. The sentence was, I'm taking from here much more than I brought, and I hope one day I can give back at least a little of what I received. He read the letter in under a minute. Signed the termination paperwork. Sent it to HR to process. And felt, you know what he felt? Relief. Relief. Relief that the situation resolved itself. Relief that he didn't have to get his hands dirty. Relief that his narrative was confirmed. I knew she'd leave, I knew she wasn't committed, she asked to go, I didn't do anything. And life went on. Denise left. Claudia was sad for a few days. She brought the extra lunch out of habit the following Monday and only realized when she got to the clinic and remembered Denise wasn't there anymore. Stood there looking at the container in her hand like she'd lost something. But then the daily grind swallowed it. As it swallows everything. The clinics grew. The 5th came. Then the 6th. Richard became a reference in the industry. Appeared in magazine features. Won Entrepreneur of the Year from the local Chamber of Commerce, that photo of him in a suit, holding a trophy, smiling at the camera, that ended up framed in the lobby of every clinic. And then 2018 came. And the diagnosis. And the 7 months. And that beep. And the silence of a penthouse far too large for one person. And the years kept passing. 2019, the first Christmas alone, when he bought a gift for Claudia out of habit and only realized when he got home with the bag. 2020, the pandemic, which nearly bankrupted 2 clinics, which forced him to lay off 30 employees in 2 weeks, which made him sleep at the office because the empty penthouse was unbearable at night. 2021, 22, 23, 24, 25. Each year more like the one before. Work, home, work, home. The film of life playing without changing scenes. His son, Tiago, called every Sunday. But the calls kept getting shorter. Started at 40 minutes, then 30, then 20, then they were 10 minutes of everything good, Dad? Everything's good, son, alright then, talk soon. Friends drifted away, or maybe he was the one pulling back, declining invitations, canceling dinners, saying, this week doesn't work, until they stopped asking. He could never tell if they disappeared or if he hid. And maybe it didn't matter. And then in 2026, this year, something happened that seemed small. That seemed insignificant. A conversation at a dinner. The kind of dinner you attend out of obligation and normally forget the next day. But this conversation wouldn't leave his head. Richard was at a business event. One of those networking dinners at a fancy downtown hotel, decorated ballroom, white-gloved waiters, everyone in suits pretending to be happy and looking for someone to swap business cards with. And at his table, one of those round tables with 8 seats that event organizers love, sat a guy named Fernando. Fernando owned a chain of pharmacies. Early 60s. White beard. Sharp eyes. One of those men who'd aged well because they made peace with life instead of fighting it. Conversation drifted, markets, taxes, economy, the things businessmen talk about without saying anything, and Fernando mentioned, just like that, in the middle of a sentence, almost in passing, that he'd just visited a former employee of his who'd gotten sick. He'd gone to her house. Brought flowers. Talked with the family. Helped with the hospital bill. Richard found it strange. Set his fork down, looked at Fernando and asked, with genuine curiosity, why he would do that. Visit a former employee. Spend time and money on someone who didn't even work for him anymore. And Fernando stopped eating. Set his utensils aside. Looked at Richard with an expression of someone who doesn't understand the question, because for him it was so obvious it shouldn't need explaining. And he said, because she worked with me for 10 years, Richard. 10 years. She was part of my life. Ate lunch with me. Laughed with me. Helped me grow. You don't just vanish from people's lives because an employment contract ended. And that sentence, you don't just vanish from people's lives because a contract ended, stuck in Richard's head like a splinter. Aching. Throbbing. Refusing to go away. And in the days that followed, not that night, because that night he drank too much whiskey and fell asleep on the couch, but in the days after, Denise's name started surfacing in his thoughts. For the first time in years. He thought about her in the morning while making coffee. Thought about her in traffic, driving to work. Thought about her smile when Claudia brought lunch. About the careful handwriting of the resignation letter. About the especially Claudia, underlined. About that girl from Riverside, almost 2 hours by bus, who showed up every day before everyone else. And alongside those thoughts came something he didn't expect, something he didn't recognize right away because it was a feeling he wasn't used to having. Guilt. A strange, shapeless guilt that appeared and vanished like fog. Because rationally, in his head, he hadn't done anything wrong. She left because she wanted to. He just stopped investing in her. Redirected resources. Optimized. That's not wrong. That's management. That's what any businessman would do. Right? Right? But the guilt was there. Beneath the logic. Beneath the reason. Beneath all the justifications he'd been repeating for 13 years. And with the guilt came a curiosity he couldn't ignore. What happened to Denise? Where did she go after leaving the clinic? What did she do with her life? Was she okay? Did she make it? Richard tried to find her. Searched Denise Oliver on Instagram, hundreds of profiles came up, none of them her. Facebook, same thing. LinkedIn, nothing. He tried the old phone number from the HR files, disconnected. Sent a text message, a gray arrow that never turned blue. Asked former employees, nobody knew anything. Denise had simply vanished. Disappeared. As if the city had swallowed her whole. And that bothered Richard more than he wanted to admit. Because when you can't find someone, your imagination fills the space. And Richard's imagination, now fed by guilt, started painting dark scenarios. What if she'd been unable to find work? What if she never recovered after leaving? What if her departure from the clinic had knocked her down for good? What if her sick mother had gotten worse and Denise had been trapped in that little house in Riverside, caring for someone with nobody caring for her? What if he'd ruined that girl's life? That's when Richard did something he'd never done before. Something he would have found absurd if anyone had suggested it a week earlier. He hired a private investigator. Yes, a PI. To find a former employee who'd resigned 13 years ago. When he called the investigation agency and explained what he wanted, the receptionist went silent for a few seconds and then asked, "Sir, do you have any personal involvement with this individual? Is this a child support case? A custody matter?" And Richard said, No, nothing like that. She just worked for me and I want to know how she's doing." And the receptionist went, that means, "Okay, sir, you do you," and transferred him to the investigator. When he told Tiago during the Sunday phone call, his son went silent for 5-6 seconds, and 5 seconds of silence on the phone is an eternity, and said, "Dad, is everything okay with you?" And Richard said yes, everything was fine, it was just something he needed to resolve. An unfinished matter. But it wasn't an office matter. It was a matter of the soul. The kind that doesn't expire. The investigator, a guy named Bobby, heavyset, thick mustache, the look of someone who's seen everything and isn't impressed by anything anymore. Bobby took 11 days. 11 days of work that included database searches, public records, visits to old addresses, conversations with neighbors. And on the 11th day he called Richard. Found your person. He came in person to Richard's office to deliver the report. A thin manila envelope. Inside were 3 pages. Full name. Social security number. Current address. Some supplementary details. Denise lived in a town called Cedar Park, just north of Austin, about 25 minutes from downtown. Lived in a modest house in a lower middle-class neighborhood, paved streets but with cracks, row houses, a stray dog on the sidewalk. She wasn't married. No domestic partnership on record. Lived alone, her mother had passed in 2022. And this piece of information hit Richard like a punch to the gut, she had no formal employment record for the past 2 years. No W-2. No active business registration. Nothing indicating she was working. Richard stared at that page for a long time. No job for 2 years. Mother dead. Living alone in a small house in Cedar Park. And that guilt that had been fog turned into a storm. Because in his mind, in that narrative his brain was now reconstructing in reverse, he saw a straight line between Denise's departure from the clinic and that reality. Left the clinic, couldn't get properly re-established, her mother worsened, life fell apart, and now she was there, with nothing. And it was his fault. He decided he would visit her. Didn't send a message, he didn't have her contact. Didn't send a letter, that would be odd. Didn't call, he had no number. Decided to go. In person. The Richard way. Eye to eye. Presence. He chose a Saturday. Woke up early. Shaved. Wore something simple, jeans, a polo shirt, casual shoes. He didn't want to look like the penthouse executive from downtown visiting the former employee from Riverside. He wanted to look like what he was, a man with remorse trying to do the right thing, whatever that thing might be. He bought a bouquet of flowers at a neighborhood florist. White lilies. Because Claudia loved white lilies, and when he thought of flowers, Claudia was who came to mind. And a gourmet breakfast basket, one of those large ones, with cheese, imported preserves, artisan bread, juice, fruit. Put everything on the back seat and drove to Cedar Park. 25 minutes on the road. And during those 25 minutes, every mile, every traffic light, every turn, he rehearsed what he'd say. "Denise, I came to apologize." "No." Too direct. Alarming. She'd think, apologize for what, and he'd have to explain everything right there at the door, and it'd be a disaster. Denise, I've been thinking about you and wanted to see how you're doing. Better. Lighter. More human. Denise, it's been a long time, and I feel like I owe you. Owe you what? An explanation? An apology? Money? He didn't know. And that was the naked truth. Richard didn't know exactly what he was seeking with that visit. Redemption? Forgiveness? Or just confirmation that he was the villain of the story, so he could finally give that guilt a shape and a name and maybe, just maybe, learn to live with it? He reached the street. Parked in front of a small convenience store. Got out. The neighborhood was quiet for a Saturday morning. A dog lying on the sidewalk lifted its head when he passed and went back to sleep. He walked to the house. Stopped in front of it. Looked. It was a single-story house. White walls with some moisture stains along the base. An iron gate painted blue, a nice blue, not neglected. A clean cement walkway in front. A small garden, if you could call it a garden, with herb pots in the window. Basil. Rosemary. Mint. And something he noticed immediately, there was a wheelchair ramp at the entrance. A concrete ramp, well built, with iron handrails on both sides, painted the same blue as the gate. He thought it was strange. But didn't think much of it. Her mother was sick, so the ramp was probably for her. He got out of the car. Picked up the flowers in one hand and the basket in the other. Walked to the gate. His heart was pounding in a way he hadn't felt since when? Since the hospital. Since Claudia. That same anxiety of someone who knows they're about to face something they can't control. Something that might change everything. He rang the doorbell. A simple doorbell, one of those that goes ding-dong. And waited. Heard footsteps inside. Light footsteps. And the door opened. And it was Denise. But not the Denise he remembered. 15 years do that to people, they transform. She was thinner. Her hair, which used to be long, dark, always pulled back in a tight bun, was now short, chin-length, with white strands she made no effort to hide. Her face had lines that weren't there before, at the corners of her eyes, on her forehead, around her mouth. Lines from someone who'd smiled a lot, or cried a lot, or both. But her eyes were exactly the same. That direct, transparent gaze that didn't look away, that didn't apologize for existing. The same look from the interview in 2011. And when she saw who it was, her face did something Richard hadn't expected. Not even in his best rehearsals. She didn't look scared. Didn't look angry. Didn't look confused. Didn't slam the door. She smiled. A wide, open, genuine smile that rose from her lips to her eyes and lit up her entire face. As if she'd been waiting for this visit her whole life. "Richard," she said, and her voice trembled. Just slightly. That tremor of contained emotion. "Oh my God, Richard." And before he could say anything, any of the sentences he'd rehearsed in the car, she opened the gate and hugged him. A tight hug. Long. One of those that passes 5 seconds and enters the territory of, this isn't just politeness, this is feeling. And Richard, standing there with a bouquet of lilies in one hand and a breakfast basket in the other, felt his eyes burn. Because in that hug there was something he hadn't received from anyone in years. Warmth. Real human warmth. Come in, please," she said, pulling him by the arm, her voice excited like a young girl's. And he went in. The house was small. Living room, open kitchen, a hallway with 2 doors. Everything simple, but everything clean. Spotless. With that scent of a well-kept home, fresh coffee mixed with cleaning products and something sweet, maybe cake. In the living room, a 2-seat couch with a folded blanket on the arm. A small coffee table with a vase of flowers, daisies from the garden. And on the wall, a bookshelf. A bookshelf packed with books. Richard noticed it immediately. The Denise he knew wasn't particularly into books. But there were shelves overflowing. Business administration, psychology, education, and many, many books about health, about palliative care, about nursing, about neurological diseases, about Alzheimer's. "Sit down, Richard, make yourself at home, I'll make us some coffee." He sat on the couch, placed the flowers and the basket on the coffee table. And while she went to the kitchen, and he heard the kettle, the clink of cups, the spoon in the sugar bowl, he looked around. Carefully. Attentively. He saw photos on the wall. Denise with a group of people, all wearing aprons, smiling at the camera, looking like healthcare workers in a makeshift facility. Denise with an older woman in a wheelchair, her mother, Marlene, for sure. Tired face but a gentle smile. Denise holding a diploma, graduation cap slightly crooked, laughing. And one photo that made his heart stop for a second. Denise with Claudia. The two of them hugging, smiling, against a background of Christmas decorations, probably a holiday party at the clinic. 2012, maybe. And in that photo Claudia wore that smile. That smile Richard knew better than anything in the world. That smile that wasn't for the camera, wasn't a pose, was pure happiness. That smile that said, "I'm here, I'm happy, this is enough." He was staring at the photo when Denise came back with 2 cups of coffee. She saw where his gaze was fixed. And stood still for a moment. In silence. "I heard about Claudia," she said softly. Almost a whisper. "I found out when it happened. I wanted to come to the funeral, but..." She hesitated. "I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome." Richard swallowed hard. His throat tightened. "You would have been welcome, Denise. I know. I know that now. Back then I wasn't sure." Silence. One of those silences that aren't empty, they're full. Full of everything left unsaid for 15 years. And then Richard took a deep breath. Set his cup on the table. And decided it was time. Time to take off the mask. Time to speak the truth. For the first time in 15 years. "Denise, I need to be honest with you. I came here because I feel I owe you a conversation. A conversation we should have had many years ago and never did. I think I was unfair to you. I think I pushed you out of the company without having the courage to admit that's what I was doing. And I need you to know, that I recognize it." Denise listened. In silence. Looking at him. Took a sip of coffee. And responded with that same honesty he'd known since 2011. No embellishment. No detour. "You want me to say it didn't hurt?" Pause. "It hurt. It hurt a lot, Richard. I spent months after leaving the clinic trying to understand what I'd done wrong. I turned over every decision in my head, every action, every word, searching for where I'd messed up. I questioned myself. Blamed myself. Thought I was stupid. That I was incapable. That I didn't deserve to be there. That Claudia felt sorry for me and you'd finally seen the truth, that I was a fraud. That followed me for a long time. A very long time. Every word was a needle. And Richard deserved every one. But I didn't come here to make you feel bad," he said, his voice faltering. "I came to apologize. I came to say I was wrong." And then Denise did something he didn't expect. Something he wouldn't have predicted in 1,000 scenarios. She laughed. Not with mockery. Not with bitterness. A light, almost affectionate laugh. A laugh that seemed to say, "Oh, Richard, you have no idea. Richard, you don't need to apologize. Not anymore." "What do you mean, not anymore?" "Because I need to tell you something. Several things, actually. And these things are going to completely change how you see all of this." Richard felt a chill creep up the back of his neck. Not fear. Anticipation. That visceral feeling that the ground is about to shift under your feet. "When I left the company," Denise began, and her voice grew steadier, as if she'd told this story before, to herself, many times, "I was in a very bad place. Very bad. I moved back in with my mother. Her depression had gotten worse. She barely left her room. And I arrived there with no job, no prospects, feeling like the worst person in the world, and for a few days I sank right along with her. Stayed in bed. Didn't eat. Didn't answer the phone. Nothing. Pause. But then I remembered something. Something that saved me. Remember that day, Richard? That Friday? Richard felt his blood run cold. That Friday when you walked past the front desk and I minimized the screen. She knew. She always knew. You saw. And I knew the instant you saw. I saw it in your eyes. And I knew, right then, in that second, that something had changed. That something had broken. I saw it in how you treated me afterward. It was different. Colder. More distant. Doors that used to be open started closing, one by one, and I was on the outside trying to understand why. Denise, let me finish. Please. Because what I was doing on that screen. I know you had someone check. Had them pull the browsing history. Didn't you? Richard nodded. Ashamed. His face burning. Right. And they found I was looking at an online course. A financial management course. And you interpreted that as me getting ready to leave. To look for something better. That I was being disloyal. Isn't that what you thought? Richard nodded again. Couldn't speak. Richard, and her voice turned softer, almost gentle, as if she felt sorry for him, not the other way around. I was looking at that course because of the company. For the company. I wanted to qualify myself. I wanted to learn financial management because you were expanding, you were growing, and I wanted to be able to help more. Wanted to be more useful. Wanted to earn a promotion. That course cost $350, and I was making $1,400 a month back then, Richard. $350 was almost a quarter of my salary. I was there, on that screen, calculating whether I could pay for it in 3 installments on my credit card without falling behind on my mother's rent. That's what I was doing. And I minimized the screen because I was ashamed. Ashamed. Ashamed that you might think I was goofing off on the computer instead of working. I didn't want you to think badly of me. I cared so much about what you thought. Her voice cracked. She stopped. Breathed. Continued. I was investing in you, Richard. And you discarded me for it. The silence that followed that sentence lasted. I don't know how long. Might have been 10 seconds. Might have been a minute. Felt like an hour. Richard felt his stomach turn. Felt his face burn. Felt his hands shake. Felt 15 years of absolute certainty, 15 years of, I was right, I did what I had to do, she's the one who left, crumble like a sandcastle in a wave. Every piece. Every justification. Every night he slept soundly. All of it was a lie. A lie he told himself. She was studying to stay. And he thought she was preparing to leave. She was investing in him. And he threw her away. But that's not what I want to tell you, Richard. He raised his eyes. Red. Wet. That's just the beginning. Richard felt the ground about to disappear completely. When I left the company and went back to my mother's house, I was shattered. But after a few days at rock bottom, I remembered something. A phrase. A phrase Claudia told me once, on a rainy day, when she was giving me a ride home and I was complaining about something, I don't even remember what. And she looked at me, with that calm way of hers, and said, Denise, life isn't what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens. And that day, at rock bottom, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I decided I was going to do something with what had happened to me. Didn't know what. But something. Denise stood up. Went to the bookshelf. Picked up a framed document and brought it to him. Placed it in his hands as if it were something precious. It was a diploma. Healthcare Services Management. With honors. Accredited institution. I paid for that program with my severance from the clinic. It took 2.5 years. And during those 2.5 years I studied at night and before dawn, and during the day I took care of my mother, who was getting worse every month. I slept 4 hours a night. Sometimes 3. Drank coffee like it was water. Cried in the bathroom before class and dried my tears on the bus. But I finished. Finished with the highest grade in my class. She put the diploma back. Picked up another document. A certification. Palliative care. Issued by a leading healthcare institution in the state. When my mother got worse, and she got much worse, Richard, the depression deepened, and on top of it came Alzheimer's, which is the cruelest thing that exists, watching someone forget who they are, bit by bit. When that happened, I realized something. I realized there were thousands of families like mine. Thousands. Families where one person alone, usually a daughter, a wife, a granddaughter, carried the crushing weight of caring for someone who was fading away. Without help. Without money for a professional caregiver. Without medical guidance. Without emotional support. Without anyone to say, "It's okay, you're not alone." And I thought, I need to do something for these people. Richard was listening to every word. But his heart was hammering so hard he could barely process it. I built something, Richard. While you were opening the 5th and 6th clinic, winning Entrepreneur of the Year, showing up in magazines, I was in my little room in Riverside, with my mother sleeping in the room next door, building something. She went to the bedroom. Came back with an old laptop, the kind with stickers on the cover. Opened it. Turned it on. Showed him. It was a website. Simple. Functional. Soft colors. The name at the top of the page was House of Care. And underneath the name, a motto, Nobody Cares Alone. Richard looked. And understood. It took a moment, but he understood. It was an organization. A non-profit. An organization that provided free support, completely free, to caregivers of people with degenerative diseases in the Austin metropolitan area. Psychological support. Medical guidance. Weekly support groups. Home visits from volunteer nurses. Hands-on training for family caregivers who didn't know how to give a bath, how to change an adult diaper, how to handle an aggression episode from a patient with dementia. Self-care workshops for the caregiver themselves, because caregivers get sick too, sick from exhaustion, from loneliness, from guilt, and nobody talks about it. We started in 2016, Denise said, and now her voice carried pride, a quiet pride but unmistakable. Me and 2 nurses I met during my program. We held sessions in my living room, Richard. In my living room. With 3 plastic chairs and a whiteboard I bought secondhand. 5 families a month in the beginning. 5. And I thought that was incredible. She clicked on a tab on the website. Annual report. Over time, volunteers started showing up. A psychologist who heard about us through word of mouth. A retired physical therapist who wanted to feel useful. Recently graduated social workers who needed extra hours. Then small donations started coming in, $100 here, $50 there. A neighborhood bakery started sending snacks for the meetings. A local print shop made our flyers for free. The thing kept growing. Slowly. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without marketing. Without anyone filming it to post online. She turned the screen toward him. Today the House of Care serves 140 families a month, Richard. 140. We have 26 regular volunteers. Partnerships with 3 hospitals. An agreement with the county health department. And last year we won a national award for best practices in community health. Richard looked at the screen. Looked at the photos. Saw faces of elderly people being cared for with dignity. Saw faces of exhausted caregivers being embraced, held, heard. Saw rooms full of people sitting in circles, sharing pain and finding strength. And saw Denise's face in almost every photo, always there, always present, always with that direct gaze, now accompanied by a smile he didn't recognize. A smile of someone who'd found her place in the world. And then Denise said something that knocked Richard down completely. "And there's something I've never told anyone. Anyone at all. Not the volunteers. Not the nurses. Nobody." She set the laptop aside. Looked him in the eye. "When Claudia got sick, in 2018, I found out. I still knew people who worked in the insurance network, and her name came up in a system. And I knew the diagnosis. And I knew the prognosis." Long pause. "And I went, Richard. I went to the hospital." Richard stopped breathing. "What do you mean you went to the hospital?" "I went every week. For 7 months. Every Tuesday. I'd leave my house at 5 in the afternoon, take 2 buses, and get to the hospital around 6:30. I didn't go into the room. I talked to the nurses on the floor. Asked how she was doing. If she was eating. If she was in pain. If she needed anything. And every Tuesday I left a flower arrangement at the floor's reception desk, with no card, no name, nothing." Richard felt the tears come all at once. Without warning. Without control. Like a dam breaking. Because he remembered. He remembered. The flowers. White lilies. Every Tuesday. They appeared in Claudia's room without explanation. He'd ask the nurses, who sent these flowers, and nobody knew. He'd ask at the front desk, who left this arrangement, and they'd say, a young woman, sir, but she didn't want to give her name. And Claudia, already weak, barely able to speak, with sunken eyes and skin thin as paper, Claudia would smile every Tuesday when she saw the lilies. And say, in a voice that was almost a whisper, "It's an angel, Richard. Someone out there cares." It was Denise. The girl he'd pushed out. The employee he'd frozen. The person he'd judged as disloyal, as uncommitted, as disposable. That person spent 7 months, every Tuesday, taking 2 buses, to send anonymous flowers to the wife of the man who'd derailed her career. "I wanted to go into the room," Denise said, and now she was crying too. Silent tears running down her face. "I wanted to hold her hand. I wanted to tell her I was there. That I never forgot what she did for me. But I didn't know if you'd want to see me. If I'd be welcome. So I stayed in the hallway. I'd sit in a chair near the elevator and just stay there. Sometimes for an hour. Sometimes longer. And when I saw you come out of the room for coffee or to stretch your legs, I'd hide. Go to the restroom. Or go down a floor. One time I almost bumped into you at the elevator. The doors opened and there you were. I pressed the button for another floor and ran down the stairs, heart pounding." Richard was bent over with his elbows on his knees and his face buried in his hands. And he wept. Wept in a way he hadn't at Claudia's funeral. In a way he hadn't at the memorial. In a way he hadn't in any moment of the last 8 years. Because this wasn't sadness. It was bigger than sadness. It was the overwhelming realization that he'd spent 15 years living inside a completely wrong version of reality. That he'd built an entire narrative about someone, about who this person was, about what this person wanted, about what this person deserved, and discovered that every single piece of that narrative was a lie. A lie nobody told him. A lie he told himself. "But I'm still not done, Richard." He raised his face. Eyes destroyed. After Claudia passed, I was shattered. I cried for days. And I didn't even have the right to cry that much, did I? I wasn't family. I was just a former employee. But I loved that woman. She was the mother I never had. And when she was gone, I decided I was going to do something in her honor. Because Claudia was the person who taught me what it means to care for someone without expecting anything back. She's the one who planted that in me. Every lunch she brought. Every ride in the rain. Every, "How's your mother doing, Denise?" It was her planting a seed. And I wanted that seed to become a tree. Denise stood up. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Richard stood. His legs were shaking. She walked down the narrow hallway, walls lined with more photos, more certificates, more faces, and opened the last door. It was a small room. But not a bedroom. It was an office. A desk with a computer. A printer. Filing cabinets. Folders. On the walls, framed photos of families. Dozens of families. Elderly people smiling. Caregivers embracing. Children drawing next to grandparents in wheelchairs. Life. So much life on those walls. And in the center of the main wall, in a frame larger than the others, with a light wooden border, a photo. Claudia. That same smile. That smile Richard knew better than anything. And below the photo, a clear acrylic plaque, with engraved letters. Richard stepped closer. His legs barely obeying. Read. The Claudia Mendez Wing, Family Caregiver Support Center. Read it again. And again. And again. Each time the letters blurred more because his eyes wouldn't stop filling. Everything we do at the House of Care, all the emotional support, the listening, the counseling for caregivers, happens through the Claudia Mendez Wing. That's the official name. It's in the nonprofit's charter. It's on file with the state. Every family we serve, every caregiver we help keep from losing their mind, every person who finds a little peace in the chaos of caring for someone who's fading, comes through the space that bears your wife's name. Richard leaned against the wall. His legs gave out. He slid to the floor. Sat there, on the cold floor of that little room in Cedar Park, and cried like a child. Without control. Without shame. Without that armor he'd worn his whole life. Everything came at once, the guilt, the regret, the longing, the admiration, the shock, the shame, and something he couldn't name but that hurt more than all the rest, which was the certainty that he had been small. Profoundly, irredeemably small. While he was freezing out an employee over a minimized screen, that employee was preparing to transform hundreds of lives. While he was winning Entrepreneur of the Year, that girl from Riverside was building something no award in the world could measure. While he slept in his empty penthouse thinking he knew who Denise was in the hospital hallway sending flowers to his dying wife. In silence. Without posting. Without demanding credit. Without needing anyone to know. And Denise sat down next to him. On the floor. In silence. Without saying a word. Just there. Present. The way she'd always been. Present even when no one could see. And I want you to stop for a second. Seriously. Stop. Think about what just happened here. Because the lesson of this story isn't, don't judge others. That's a bumper sticker. The lesson is deeper. More uncomfortable. More personal. Richard was an intelligent man. Successful. Respected. He wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He didn't wake up in the morning planning to harm anyone. He genuinely believed he was fair. Rational. A good person. And maybe he was. But he did something that all of us do. All of us. And that we almost never recognize. He wrote a story inside his own head. A story that made sense. A story that had logic. A story supported by a fact, the minimized screen, and by a professional opinion, the consultant's report. And with those two pieces, one misinterpreted fact and one biased opinion, he built an entire narrative about who Denise was. Disloyal. Uninterested. Mediocre. Limited. Disposable. And that narrative was so comfortable, so clean, so logical, that he never even thought to verify it. He didn't ask Denise what she was doing on the computer. Didn't sit down with her and say, Denise, I saw you minimize the screen, tell me what was going on. He didn't do the most basic, most simple, most human thing there is, he didn't ask. Because asking meant risking an answer that would destroy the narrative. And the narrative was comfortable. The narrative protected his ego. The narrative justified the decision that the most cowardly part of him already wanted to make, the decision to stop investing in Denise, to stop caring, to stop being involved. How many times have you done that? Stop and think. For real. How many times have you looked at someone, a coworker, a friend, a family member, a neighbor, and instead of asking, instead of talking, instead of listening, you just decided? Decided who that person was. Decided what they wanted. Decided what they deserved. Based on a gesture. A misinterpreted sentence. A look that maybe didn't mean what you thought it meant. And built a narrative so solid, so well supported, so logical, that not even reality could break through. Because the narrative was more comfortable than the truth. And we always choose comfort. But wait. There's more. 2 weeks after that visit, Richard was at home. Nighttime. Couldn't sleep. Sleep had left since that Saturday in Cedar Park and hadn't come back. And on one of those sleepless nights, he sat down at his office desk, opened his computer, and went digging through a folder he hadn't opened in years. Old company backups. Files from 2013. And he searched, with trembling hands on the keyboard, for the consulting report. That 87-page report that had condemned Denise. Found it. Opened it. And reread it. Page by page. With different eyes. Eyes that now knew what they hadn't known before. And on page 63, near the end of the section on Denise's individual assessment, he found something. A footnote. A footnote in small print, size 8 font, nearly invisible, squeezed into the bottom corner of the page. And it said, and I'm going to tell you exactly what was written because every word matters. Note, the employee Denise Oliver demonstrated initiative by requesting information about internal professional development programs during the evaluation period. Additionally, she expressed interest in funding supplemental training in financial management with her own resources, with the goal of expanding her contribution to the company. This factor was not considered in the present profile analysis, as it falls outside the scope of the operational performance evaluation. Did you catch that? I'll repeat the part that matters. Demonstrated initiative by requesting information about professional development. Expressed interest in funding training with her own resources. With the goal of expanding her contribution to the company. This factor was not considered in the analysis. The consultant knew. Marcus with the MBA and the slicked back hair knew that Denise wanted to grow. Knew she was seeking to upskill. Knew she was willing to pay out of her own pocket, with $350 from a $1,400 salary, to become more valuable to Richard's company. And he put that information, in a footnote. In a footnote. In size 8 font. On page 63 of 87. In a spot no busy entrepreneur would ever read. And Richard didn't read it. Because, like most of us, he read the report looking for what confirmed what he already wanted to believe. He read looking for, she doesn't have the profile. Read looking for, reallocation candidate. Read looking for permission. And he found it. Because when we look for permission to be small, we always find it. Denise wasn't the employee the consultant dismissed. She was the employee the consultant recognized, in a whisper. In small print. In the corner of a page nobody read. And Richard didn't read it. Not because he couldn't read. Not because he was illiterate. Not because he was stupid. But because reading that footnote would mean destroying the narrative. And he preferred the narrative over the truth. Richard closed the computer that night. And sat in the dark. In the silence of the penthouse. That silence that used to be uncomfortable but now felt necessary. And I truly believe, that on that night, for the first time in his life, Richard Mendez saw himself clearly. Not the award-winning entrepreneur. Not the noble widower who stayed strong. Not the devoted father who gave his son everything. But the man who let a footnote decide someone's fate. The man who chose a comfortable narrative over an uncomfortable conversation. The man who traded a 5-second question, Denise, what were you doing on the computer? For 15 years of a self-inflicted lie. And I know what you might be thinking right now. You might be thinking, I'd never do that. You might be thinking you're different. That you'd have the conversation. That you'd ask. That you wouldn't judge. But, would you? Think. Think about that person at work you decided doesn't like you, based on what? A curt email? A day they didn't say hello and maybe they'd just gotten bad news? Think about that relative you drifted from because they changed. Did they change, or did you need the narrative that they changed to justify your own withdrawal? Think about that old friend who disappeared. Did you call? Send a message? Really try? Or did you decide, if they wanted to, they'd reach out, because that narrative was more comfortable than admitting that maybe you didn't do your part? We live surrounded by Denises. People we discarded. People we underestimated. People we put in a box and closed the lid. And those people went on with their lives. Some crumbled. Some survived. And some, a rare, extraordinary few, built things so beautiful, so meaningful, so full of purpose, from the pieces we left behind, that we didn't even deserve to know. 2 weeks after that night in the dark, Richard drove back to Cedar Park. This time without flowers. Without a basket. With an envelope. Sat in the same living room. On the same couch. Drank the same coffee. And handed over the envelope. Denise opened it. Inside was a check for $500,000. And a contract. A partnership agreement between Richard Mendez's dental clinic chain and the House of Care. The contract provided monthly financial support of $15,000. Access to healthcare professionals. Infrastructure. Free management consulting. And the creation of 5 new branches of the Claudia Mendez wing in 5 underserved neighborhoods across Greater Austin, Riverside, Runberg, Dove Springs, Colony Park, and Montopolis. 5 neighborhoods where 140 more families would be served every month. Denise looked at the check. Looked at the contract. Looked at Richard. And said something. A short sentence. Simple. One he'll carry for the rest of his life. One I want you to carry. She said. Claudia knew, Richard. She always knew. And Richard understood. Finally understood. Understood what Claudia knew when she asked him to call that girl from Riverside in for an interview. Understood what Claudia knew when she brought extra lunch. When she gave rides in the rain. When she lent her jacket in the cold. Understood what her silence meant in the kitchen that evening when he said, Denise isn't interested in the company anymore. She didn't go quiet because she agreed. She went quiet because she disagreed so deeply, so completely, that she didn't even know where to start explaining it to a man who'd already made up his mind. Claudia saw Denise for who she truly was. Saw what Richard was too blind, or too proud, or too logical, or too cowardly to see. Saw that the girl from Riverside, who wore simple clothes, who spoke plainly, who had no MBA or second language, was the kind of person who changes the world without needing anyone to watch. And Claudia knew, with that wisdom certain people carry and that no school can teach, that planting kindness in that girl was planting in the most fertile ground there is. And she was right. Every flower that appeared in that hospital room was proof. Every family served by the House of Care was proof. Every exhausted caregiver who found an outstretched hand at the Claudia Mendez wing was proof. The seed Claudia planted in Denise blossomed into hundreds of lives that Claudia never saw but that somehow, in some way, carry her name. And Richard almost never knew. Almost lived and died without knowing. Because of a minimized screen and a footnote he didn't bother to read. I want to end with this image. A 52-year-old businessman. Sitting on the floor of a simple house in Cedar Park. Crying harder than he's cried in his entire life. Because he finally understood that the most loyal person he'd ever known was the very person he accused of disloyalty. And that his wife, Claudia, whom he loved but never truly listened to, always knew. Always. From the very first day. So the next time you look at someone and think you know who they are, remember Richard. Remember the minimized screen. Remember the footnote. Remember the white lilies every Tuesday. And ask yourself one question. One simple question. One that takes 5 seconds and could change everything. The question is this: am I seeing this person for who they truly are, or am I seeing the version that's most comfortable for me? Richard took 15 years, an empty penthouse, and the cold floor of a room in Cedar Park to find the answer. You don't have to take that long. You can find it now. All you have to do is ask.